They said Africa was poor. Then, Burkina Faso found $60 billion in gold. Yes, you heard that right. $60 billion. In the red dust of the Sahel, under the quiet soil of Kaya and Bolsa, a discovery large enough to rewrite the economic destiny of an entire region. And the world? Suddenly, listening. But here's the catch. This time, the government didn't smile for the cameras and hand over the keys. They locked the vault and said, "This belongs to us, not to Paris, not to Toronto, not to anyone else." That's when things got interesting, because what seemed like a mining headline became a political explosion, a declaration of sovereignty, a story not about gold, but about power, memory, and resistance. And you're about to see how it all unfolded. But before we dive in, where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments. Would you trust your government to handle 60 billion in natural resources? Or would you rather keep it under your pillow? Drop your thoughts below. We actually read every single comment. This is Africa Daily Good News, where headlines meet heart, and where we tell the stories you won't hear on cable news. Whether you're watching from Brooklyn or Birmingham, Nairobi or New Orleans, you're welcome here. This isn't just a story about Africa. This is a global conversation about wealth, about ownership, and about what happens when a small nation looks the world in the eye and says, "Not this time." Now, let's go to Burkina Faso, where the soil is rich, the stakes are higher than ever. And the countdown has already begun. It's possible for a country to be sitting on 60 billion in gold and still have children walking 5 miles just to find drinkable water. That's exactly what was happening in Burkina Faso, until now. In a recent geological survey that stunned even the most seasoned analysts, the government confirmed the presence of more than 1,200 tons of untapped gold beneath the regions of Kaya, Gawa, and Bolsa. To put it in perspective, that's more than 3 times the nation's GDP, buried in its own soil. But here's where the ground really started to shake. At the national press conference, Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't just announce the discovery. He announced a boundary. Not a single ounce would leave the country without bringing tangible benefit to its people. Every contract would be public, every dollar traceable. And for a moment, that sounded like a dream. Until you remember what usually follows a headline like this. Because history tells us, especially in Africa, that resource discoveries are not followed by schools or hospitals. They're followed by delegations from Canada, the UAE, Australia. They don't come with shovels, they come with lawyers and deals written in fine print. That's exactly what happened. Within 48 hours of the press conference, foreign investors had already begun arriving in Ouagadougou, checking into hotels and scheduling meetings. They didn't waste time. And why would they? In a system where gold rushes often reward the quickest talkers, not the rightful owners, it pays to be first. But what happens when the government doesn't play along? According to Reuters, Burkina Faso was immediately labeled Africa's new gold frontier. But behind the headlines, there was friction, because for the first time in decades, a government wasn't simply opening the gates, it was posting guards. That kind of resistance triggers something, especially in societies trained to expect a different script. Most Americans, for instance, are used to seeing African nations portrayed as either victims or clients, rarely protagonists, and even more rarely, as protectors of their own wealth. But if you think about it, most people, regardless of where they're from, don't know what they'd do if they suddenly found themselves sitting on a fortune. Psychologically, it's not the money that tests you, it's what the money reveals. A story from Kaya offers a glimpse into that tension. A local mechanic named Issouf heard the news on his radio while repairing an old motorbike. He paused, turned off the engine, and repeated the number out loud, 60 billion. Then he laughed, because he remembered his cousin in Niger who once celebrated a new uranium deal, only to spend the next 5 years watching foreign trucks roll past his village while the school roof continued to leak. There's a reason many Africans meet prosperity with caution, because history hasn't always delivered what it promised. And yet, this moment feels different. Maybe it's the tone of the government, maybe it's the mood on the streets, or maybe it's the quiet realization that this gold doesn't just represent wealth, it represents a second chance. And as the foreign suits begin circling like vultures, the people of Burkina Faso aren't just watching. They're remembering, they're comparing, they're asking, will this be like the others, or could it actually be ours? Let's find out. Foreign companies were preparing mining proposals before Burkina Faso even finished reading its own soil report. It's a detail most people missed, but it says everything. The gold hadn't been weighed. The national plan wasn't finalized. And yet, lobbyists from multiple continents were already drafting contracts, booking flights, and securing hotel suites in Ouagadougou. Some with translators, others with lawyers, all with an agenda. It's not illegal. It's just expected. Because when natural wealth is found in an African country, the assumption, historically, is that the extraction clock starts immediately, before the ink dries, before the people speak, before the nation even breathes. And then something unexpected happened. Instead of fast-tracking foreign deals behind closed doors, Captain Ibrahim Traoré paused the process. Publicly, on national television, he declared that every contract would be made transparent. No redactions, no off-record meetings, no undisclosed percentages. What followed was louder than applause. It was silence. The kind that comes when powerful interests realize the script has been rewritten, not tweaked, not revised. Rewritten. That kind of move doesn't just disrupt economics, it disrupts psychology. Because in most Western boardrooms, there's a built-in expectation. African leadership will negotiate from a position of desperation. They'll say yes quickly, because they need infrastructure or jobs or peace. And that's not always untrue. After all, when your people are struggling to eat, long-term planning becomes a luxury. But what if, just hypothetically, an African nation chose dignity over urgency? What if it said, we will wait, we will read, we will decide? For many in the global north, that's an unsettling scenario. According to a 2023 behavioral economics study from MIT, most foreign investors view underdeveloped nations not as partners, but as high-risk, high-yield opportunities. The idea of waiting on a village council for approval doesn't fit the model. So when Traoré announced that mining licenses would only be granted after full community review and that no raw gold could be exported without local refining infrastructure in place, that wasn't just policy. That was defiance. Especially for a country like Burkina Faso, whose GDP has long placed it near the bottom of every global ranking. In a world obsessed with urgency and quarterly gains, slowing down is the most radical thing a government can do. And yet, something strange started happening. Inside the country, the announcement sparked real conversations. Not the usual cynicism, but cautious hope. In Kaya, women's groups began holding weekly forums, discussing how mining profits might fund local health centers. In Bolsa, farmers met to talk water access. They weren't asking for permission, they were planning like owners. That shift, from spectators to stakeholders, isn't just economic, it's emotional. Because when people see their leaders choose transparency over speed, it triggers something. A sense that maybe, this time, the story won't be told for them. It will be told by them. In one meeting near Gawa, an elder stood up and asked a simple question. Can we build a future with gold without burying our soul beneath it? No one answered. But no one laughed either. There's a kind of tension that only arises when possibility collides with memory. Most people, Americans included, rarely think about the legacy inside their resources. They pump, refine, and consume without wondering what the land remembers. But in places where history has a longer shadow, pause is not weakness, it's respect. And in Burkina Faso right now, respect is being institutionalized, contract by contract, clause by clause. Because sometimes the most important thing a country can do after striking gold is nothing, at least not yet. The next wave of resistance didn't come from politics. It came from pressure, foreign, financial, and personal. And what happened next wasn't written in any economics manual. The first mining company to threaten legal action against Burkina Faso wasn't even operating there yet. They were still in talks, still waiting for a license, still pitching partnership models. But when the government paused all negotiations and announced a review of legacy contracts, they moved straight to arbitration. And that told everyone watching exactly what this was about. Not opportunity, not development, but control. When Traoré's administration suspended a deal signed by the previous regime, one that allowed a Canadian firm to recover 100% of its investment before sharing any profits, international media framed it as a risky move. Financial Times called it nationalist. Bloomberg warned of investor instability. And behind the scenes, diplomats began circling like flies. Some came with offers, some came with warnings. But one senior official in Ouagadougou put it simply: they smiled like partners, but they negotiated like owners. That sentence, quiet as it was, echoed through government halls. Because it named something that rarely gets said out loud: the unspoken hierarchy in global economics, where developing countries are expected to be grateful and compliant. There's a pattern here, and it's not new. A 2022 study from Georgetown University found that when resource-rich nations in the Global South renegotiate extraction contracts, they face a 70% higher risk of legal threats, aid withdrawal, or diplomatic retaliation. It's not about law, it's about precedent, because if one country resists, others might follow, and that's the real fear. Because what Burkina Faso is attempting, a full reclamation of its mining sector, is not just inconvenient, it's contagious. Most Americans have no reason to think about this. The average U.S. consumer, according to Pew Research, assumes that mineral resources come from somewhere else, and that international trade is mostly fair. But if that trade were reversed, if a foreign company came to Idaho or Kentucky, extracted billions in resources, and left only a few jobs behind, how long would that contract last? People only tolerate imbalance when it's far enough away not to feel real. That's why what Traoré did next mattered. In December, his administration negotiated a $60 million buyback of the Bangu mine, a move many economists called reckless. Critics argued that the sum was too high for a struggling economy. But Traoré didn't flinch. His response? It is better to buy back our dignity than to sell it at a discounted. And whether you agree or not, there's something about a sentence like that. It doesn't belong in a press release. It belongs in a movement. In Bolsa, after the announcement, dozens of miners took off their helmets and raised them in the air. One of them, older, with red dust in every crease of his face, told a reporter, "For once, someone is fighting like this gold is ours." There was no parade, no music, just quiet acknowledgement. And that's often how change begins, not in grand declarations, but in subtle shifts of belief. In a place where people are so used to losing that they've forgotten what it feels like to expect more. When a government nationalizes 5 major gold mines in 1 year, it sends a message. But when ordinary people start believing that message, that's when it becomes dangerous, not for them, but for the system. Some foreign investors backed off, others hired lawyers. A few governments quietly reevaluated their strategies across the Sahel. The world was paying attention, not because it loved Burkina Faso's model, but because it feared it might work. And what happened next would test more than just economics. One of the wealthiest gold discoveries in modern Africa had barely been announced, and already 17 men were dead. They weren't killed in war. They weren't targeted. They suffocated in a collapsed tunnel outside Palmer, digging with no permits, no helmets, and no exit plan. Just desperation and rumor, fueled by the promise of buried fortune. And just like that, the gold rush turned human. Most governments would have downplayed it, called it an isolated incident. But Traoré went live within 24 hours. He didn't use the words accident or unfortunate. He called it a failure of justice. Then he banned all unregulated pits and halted informal mining operations nationwide. But the deeper issue wasn't the tunnels. It was what led them there. In countries where trust in the system is thin, people don't wait for official permits. They don't believe in fair distribution. They believe, often rightly, that if they don't take the gold, someone else will. And that belief doesn't vanish with a press conference. According to a report by the International Labor Organization, informal mining now accounts for more than 40% of gold production in West Africa. It's not a side hustle. It's the system underneath the system. So even as the government tightened regulations, families in Kaya still sent boys into shallow pits. In Gawa, makeshift gold markets kept operating at night, quietly, under the eyes of locals who didn't approve, but understood. It raises a question, one that doesn't have a clean answer. What does sovereignty look like in a place where survival still overrides law? In the US, most people assume state control equals order. But even there, whenever opportunity and scarcity collide, lines blur. Think about the housing crisis. Think about bootleg opioids. Most systems break the same way, not all at once, but in the gaps. One health worker in Kaya described it best. After testing a contaminated well near a mining zone, she said, "The water turned red. The children kept drinking it anyway." Because what do you do when the gold poisons your river, but it's also your only hope of escaping it? That tension only deepened when a second crisis hit, this time invisible. In less than 8 months, respiratory illnesses among children in mining zones rose by 31%, according to the Ministry of Health. Hospitals in Gawa ran out of inhalers. A doctor, exhausted and overwhelmed, was quoted telling a mother, "The dust is stronger than our medicine." It would be easy to villainize the industry. Easier still to blame foreign investors. But the truth is more complicated and more human. If people believe wealth is finally within reach, they'll chase it through smoke, even if it chokes them. And so the government faced a choice: slow down the gold or speed up the protection. Traoré chose both. He ordered the deployment of environmental police units to monitor mining sites and shut down illegal dumps. He fast-tracked a state-funded water purification plant in Kaya. And most controversially, he proposed that every licensed mining operation must fund a local health clinic within a 5-mile radius of its site. Some called it overreach. Others called it a start. But on the ground, things moved slower than the headlines. In Bulsa, a woman named Mariam, whose son was still recovering from a lung infection, told a reporter she didn't trust government promises. Not because she hated them, but because she'd heard them before. Still, she kept the clinic flyer folded in her purse. "Just in case," she said, "maybe this time they'll mean it." And that's where the line sits now, in the space between disbelief and hope. Between red water and clean papers, between gold in the soil and dignity above it. But dignity, like gold, doesn't come free. And as the mining boom spreads, another fight is already taking shape, not in courts or contracts, but in memory. Burkina Faso was exporting millions in raw gold, while importing school textbooks from overseas. That contradiction had existed for decades, almost unchallenged. Gold left in bars. Knowledge came in boxes. But earlier this year, that equation was flipped. In a move that stunned foreign observers, Traoré's government announced that no new mining license would be approved unless the company agreed to build and operate a domestic gold refinery inside Burkina Faso's borders. No exceptions, no loopholes. Refine here or don't mine at all. For investors used to low-cost extraction and offshore processing, it was a nightmare clause. For the country's economic thinkers, it was a long overdue correction. And for ordinary citizens, it was something more personal. Proof that their labor might finally produce value not just for exports, but for futures. Because most people, given the chance, don't actually want shortcuts. They want meaning. Americans included. According to a Gallup poll on job satisfaction, the number one factor wasn't salary. It was feeling like your work matters. That's not a Western idea, that's human. And in Burkina Faso, for the first time in years, work was starting to matter in a different way. With local refineries came the demand for skilled workers, technicians, engineers, chemists. So the government announced new scholarship programs focused on metallurgy and geology. With a simple goal, train a generation that doesn't just dig gold, but understands it. And then came something even bolder. A new mandate required that 20% of all mining profits flow into community-run development funds, overseen not by central ministries, but by locally elected councils. In theory, this meant that the village where the mine sits would finally benefit before the capital city did. Some economists called it naive. Too much faith in local governance. Others argued it was the only way to ensure accountability. But in practice, something unexpected happened. In Banfura, a town that had long hosted mining operations but seen little return, the village council held its first public spending forum. People showed up with handwritten ideas: wells, solar panels, school uniforms, no cameras, no speeches, just participation. One farmer stood up with a folded piece of paper in his hand and said, "For years, we sent gold to France. This year, I want water in my village before it gets to Paris." It wasn't anger. It was arithmetic. And maybe that's the quiet revolution most people miss. It's not just about who owns the gold, but about who gets to decide what it means. Because when ownership changes, vocabulary changes too. Revenue becomes road. Royalties become medicine. Extraction becomes education. That shift doesn't require mass protest. It requires access. And access, when given to people who've lived without it, creates a new kind of intelligence: practical, localized, protective. The kind that resists not with ideology, but with questions. Like one asked recently by a student in Ouagadougou, "If this land makes us rich, why are we always asked to stay poor so others can stay calm?" No one had an answer, but no one dismissed it either. Because maybe the most dangerous citizen is the one who's just learned how things work and still chooses to believe they can be better. And in a region that's long been dictated to, that belief is now visible. In budgets, in meetings, in the quiet way people look each other in the eye again without flinching. The next phase of the struggle wasn't just political, it was cultural. Burkina Faso banned the use of cyanide near rivers, but still had no national recycling program. That's the kind of contradiction that builds pressure. A country bold enough to confront global mining giants was still vulnerable in the smallest domestic systems. Trash piled in neighborhoods. Electricity failed unpredictably. Some rural clinics ran out of gloves the same week the government reclaimed a multi-million-dollar mine. But pressure doesn't always crush. Sometimes it concentrates. And that seems to be what's happening here. Because instead of retreating under the weight of expectations, the country's response grew more deliberate and more local. Shortly after the mining reforms, a new policy was introduced that barely made international headlines. It wasn't flashy, but it was foundational. From that point forward, every registered mining operation would be required to contribute a percentage of revenue toward cultural preservation. Not just environment, not just infrastructure. Culture. That meant oral history programs, sacred site protections, archiving traditional knowledge. Because the government had realized something most development models ignore. You can't build a future if you've erased your past. This move caught even some of Traoré's supporters off guard. Wasn't this about gold? Wasn't this about fighting exploitation? But maybe that's the twist. Because once a nation stops begging to be seen as useful, it begins demanding to be seen as whole. In most Western frameworks, identity is often treated like decoration, something to celebrate once the real work is done. But in many African societies, it's the opposite. Identity isn't afterthought, it's first principle. That's why, in the Moray-speaking regions of northern Burkina Faso, elders pushed back when new tailing zones threatened ceremonial lands. Not with protests, but with language. One of them reportedly told a district official, "If you mine the place where we speak to the dead, who do you expect will protect the living?" That story spread faster than any press release. And it shaped the next phase of the reform, a government decree establishing heritage reserves, untouchable zones where no mining, building, or development would be allowed. Not because they were economically valuable, but because they were spiritually irreplaceable. You might ask, why now? Why protect culture at the very moment economic opportunity knocks louder than ever? Maybe because people understand instinctively, when you're finally at the table, that's exactly when you remember who you are. Or risk losing it. Most Americans, if asked, would say they want prosperity. But surveys show that fulfillment often comes not just from income, but from meaning, from legacy, from continuity. The same is true here, and so in villages across the Sahel, conversations that once centered on lack of funds, lack of power, lack of control, are starting to shift. They're not romantic. They're practical. One young leader in Toma put it this way: "If the world wants our gold, they should understand our ghosts too." No translation needed. That's what sovereignty sounds like when it matures. Not just loud, but layered. Not just reactive, but rooted. And as Burkina Faso walks this uncertain road, surrounded by lawsuits, under pressure from lenders, with expectations at every turn, it's not just resisting, it's remembering. And in that memory, a different kind of wealth is forming. One that doesn't spike on stock charts, but still moves people. Whether it will hold, that's another story. But as long as people keep asking what comes after the gold, there's reason to keep watching. Burkina Faso made global headlines for finding gold. But the real story wasn't the discovery, it was the refusal. Not the moment they uncovered 60 billion in mineral wealth. The moment they said, "You can't have it unless it helps our people first." That's when the narrative shifted from economics to sovereignty. And that's when the pressure really began. Since that announcement, the country has faced legal threats, diplomatic pushback, investment pullouts, and mounting internal strain. At the same time, it has rewritten mining laws, reclaimed land, closed toxic sites, and redirected wealth into community control. From the outside, it looks like a gamble. From the inside, it feels like a reckoning. Because what started as a resource story has become a values story, one where profits aren't the only goal, one where dignity isn't traded for speed. And maybe that's more familiar than it seems. Most people, Americans included, have at some point felt like a number in someone else's spreadsheet. According to a Harvard study on workplace identity, the most common reason people leave jobs isn't pay, it's powerlessness. The feeling that decisions affecting your life are being made by someone you'll never meet. Now scale that up to a nation. Imagine watching your rivers polluted, your traditions bulldozed, and your labor extracted, so that someone on the other side of the world can hedge their portfolio. How long until a country decides, enough? In Burkina Faso, that line has been drawn. Not perfectly, not without cost, but clearly. One radio journalist in Ouagadougou described it this way: "For years, we exported gold and imported silence. Now, we export a message. You can feel it in the streets. Not euphoria, but something steadier. A return of voice, a willingness to question, a refusal to accept that struggle means surrender." That shift isn't limited to borders. It speaks to anyone who's ever been told their value lies only in what they can give away. And if you've watched this far, maybe part of you recognizes that too. So tell us, where are you watching from? What would dignity look like if your own community controlled its wealth, its story, its future? Drop a comment. Share a thought. We read all of them, and if this story stayed with you, don't let it end here. Subscribe. Share it forward. Because in a media landscape flooded with fear and distraction, stories like this, where people reclaim power quietly, deliberately, often vanish before they can grow. But not this time. This is Africa Daily Good News, and we believe that stories worth telling are stories worth standing with. We'll see you in the next one.